Now I have the pleasure and privilege of requesting our most esteemed President of India to address the gathering.
Honorable Governor, Justice P. Savasidan, Honorable Chief Minister, Sri Piniyadi Vijayan, Professor Selin Musbi, President, Indian History Congress, Professor P. K. Radhakrishnan, Vice Chancellor, University of Kerala, Sri G. Ravindranath, Minister for Education, Government of Kerala, Sri Kathakampally Surendran, Minister for Cooperation, Tourism, Government of Kerala, Ramesh Chenithala, Leader of Opposition, Kerala Legislative Assembly, V.K. Prashant, Mayor, Thiruvananthapuram Corporation, distinguished members of the 77th session of Indian History Congress, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a very happy occasion for me to be present amidst you on the 77th session of the Indian History Congress. I express my deep gratitude to the organization for inviting me to be present and also to award me the status of the chief guest of this conference in its inaugural session. I had the privilege of attending one of your congress, that is 56th Congress, which was hosted by Vishwabharati University in December 2005. As the history of the Indian History Congress has been narrated both by Chief Minister Kerala and also reiterated by the Governor of Kerala, Justice Satyasivan, I would like to point out that it was very correctly dropped the word modern from the title of the conference, which had its first session in 1935, within 3 years in 1938. Because Indian history does not contain only the history of the contemporary period, and particularly the history with which we were accustomed. I passed my school leaving examination on the syllabus of history which was prepared under the colonial rulers, and out of 100 marks, 40 marks were dedicated to the history of England, and out of 60 marks it was divided between 3 very important parts of Indian history: ancient, medieval and modern. And modern Indian history, as per the syllabus then prevailed, was nothing but the narrations of the contributions of the British Governor-Generals, first 100 years under the rule of East India Company, and next 90 years under the rule of British sovereign. Therefore, as it was pointed out by the first president of the Indian History Congress in 1935, Professor Safat Ahmed Khan of Allahabad University, in his presidential address, the important task for the members of the History Congress. He said, reconstruction of Indian history should first of all be primarily the task of the Indian historians. Secondly, Indian historians should highlight those integrating factors that have made India a nation. Even 81 years after the beginning of the first session of History Congress, these two issues are quite relevant and appear to be most topical today. Historical studies today engage in examining the past of every aspect of human life and every class of people, and even the environment that surrounds us. Marc Bloch, the well-known French historian and author of The Historian's Craft, has described this as the construction of a comprehensive history. The task of Indian historians today is therefore much more multifaceted and complex than what was visualized at the inception of it in the 30s of the last century. So for the second task, namely tracing the evolution of the India of India as a unified country with all its diversities, this remains as exciting a subject as ever. I am 82 years old now, and since my maturity I always wonder how a country right now having more than 1.3 billion people, 1,600 languages, 1,600 dialects, 200 languages practiced in everyday life, 7 religions, all 3 major ethnic groups, Caucasians, Dravidians, Mongolite. But still, with this huge diversity, they live under one flag, one constitution, under one citizenship, that is Indian citizenship. I always wonder, what is the essential chemistry which has bound these millions and millions of people into one identity, and the identity which has always celebrated diversities did never attempt to convert it into uniformity. It enjoyed the huge diversities in language, religion, race, culture, day-to-day lives, usage, social systems, customs, so on and so forth. Therefore, to my mind, the historians of today, through their analytical mind, scientific observations, and clinical appreciation of the facts and matters which are available at their command, to point out that strength, because it is not merely for theoretical and academic knowledge and pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake, but it is essential for strengthening our concept of Indian nationhood. We shall have to find out the reasons. What are the commonalities and what affinities keep together persons belonging to Kashmir and to far south in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Even in the earlier days, For instance, the famous poet Amir Khusro in the early 14th century gave us a perception of the whole India as it existed at that time and in his perception through a listing of the Indian languages. The languages which he listed and which he defined as Indian, Hindi, included Sindhi, Lahori, that is Punjabi, Kashmir, Jibar, Dhor, Samundri, that is Kannada, Telangi, Telugu, Gujarati, Mabadi, Tamil, Gaudi Bengali, Awadhi, and the dialects spoken around Delhi and some other areas. I do not know whether consciously or unconsciously, when Tagore composed Jana Gana Mano, he represented all the regions in his song, starting from Punjab to Gujarat, to Odisha, to Dravid, to Utkal, to Bongo. But it is also a fact, again in the language of poet Rabindranath Tagore, while describing this whole of Indianness, in his famous poem Bharat Tirth, he described, nobody knows when, how, the endless streams and flows of people came from different directions, from different linguistic groups, ethnic groups, civilizations, social systems, but mingled into one great identity, and that great identity is that of Indian. Therefore, to my mind, we must keep in mind that there is no conflict in the pursuit of the history, national history, and also pursuit the regional history. There is no contradiction. Indeed, the more we know about our regions, the more we enrich the history of whole country. I was a student of Calcutta University, and I remember, of course, many of them retired long ago before I was admitted as a student of Calcutta University, starting from Sir Jodhanath Sarkar to Professor R.C. Majumdar, Professor N.K. Sinha, Professor D.C. Sarkar, Professor B.N. Mukherjee, and others. No doubt, many of their contributions were on the different aspects of political, social, and economic history of Bengal. But equally, their eyes were not taken away from the larger scene and canvas of Indian history. If Sir Jodhanath Sarkar is appreciated for his monumental work like History of Bengal, his contribution in narrating the reigns of Aurangzeb or that of the contemporary period during Aurangzeb's is no less important an asset to the studies of Indian history. Similarly, Professor N.K. Sinha authored a detailed work on the economic history of the colonial Bengal. Yet, he also compiled the standard biography of the famous ruler of Mysore, Hyder Ali, because to him it appeared that the resistance of the expansion of the then East India Company, which was done by Hyder Ali, was correct thing to keep India free from the foreign ants and rulers. The great authority of South Indian history, S. Krishnaswamy Iyengar, published important studies of the Guptas and Gurjars of northern India. Distinguished delegates, whether we focus on regional or national history, what is needed the most in our approach to history is what we should be as objective as possible. This is of course true with respect to all subjects of inquiry and academic activities. Behind many professions of impartiality may be deeply rooted sentiments of prejudice or an innate sense of superiority. It is useful in this regard to recall what Edward Said's influential work of 1978, Orientalism, where he critically scrutinized the chains of objectivity of writing in the West on Asian culture and history. It will be unfair to deny that Western Orientalists introduced a broader conception of history and a more critical attitude towards historical evidences than our own traditional analysts. Orientalists depicted our early scripts, discovered Ashoka for us, and tracked as well as translated an enormous amount of source materials. They deserve our gratitude for the valuable work they have done. However, Edward Said's work serves as a warning against the intrusion of personal prejudice into historical interpretation. In my view, every branch of knowledge, whether it is one of the so-called exact science or belongs to the spheres of humanities and social science, prospers only when clinical objectivity is maintained. It is often the case in history that evidence is either so scarce that the room for speculation is extremely wide, or it is so massive that the historian is unable to explore more than a small part of the available data. Personal proclivities for scholars such as loyalists to nation, religion, etc. can influence their choice when evidence suggests not a single occurrence but a range of possibilities. How should one guard itself against the temptation in such a situation? I would venture to recommend that the reason and moderation alone should be our guide. It is natural to love one's country, see as much glory to its past as one can detect, but patriotism should not result in blinkered approaches to interpreting history or compromise with truth in order to justify an argument of choice. No society is perfect, and history must be also seen as a guide on what went wrong and what were the contradictions, deficiencies, and weakness of the past. The study of history will be of use to us in shaping our conduct today only if undertaken with objectivity, and my impression is that mainstream Indian historiography has been quite conscious of these responsibilities. Distinguished delegates, an objective pursuit of history, such as our best historians have attempted, requires an impartial mind of a judge and not that of the mind of an advocate. With due respect to you, sir, we must keep our eyes open for unfamiliar ideas and be ready to consider a range of different inferences or assumptions. This necessarily bars intolerance of contrary opinions or judgments. There has been an unfortunate tendency in our country from time to time to take umbrage at the expression of any view expressed to be hostile to our social and cultural institutions, past or present. Similarly, critical approaches of our heroes and national icons of the past have been made with hostility and sometimes even violence. The freedom to doubt, disagree and dispute intellectually must be protected as an essential pillar of our democracy. Nothing should be outside the realm of reason and therefore of discussion and argument. Such freedom is vital for progress in any field, especially a calling and a craft like history. It is my firm conviction that India's pluralism and social, cultural, linguistic and religious diversity are our greatest strength. Our traditions have always celebrated the argumentative Indian, not the intolerant Indian. Multiple views, thoughts and philosophies have competed with each other peacefully for centuries in our country, and freedom of speech is one of the most important fundamental rights guaranteed by our Constitution. The Indian History Congress has a creditable record of standing up for freedom of expression and asking historians to be faithful to the cause of reason. It has often taken the cudgels against distortions of history. I hope the Indian History Congress will continue to remain alert and vigilant in the cause of an objective study of history. I am very happy to learn that the Indian History Congress regularly publishes its annual proceedings, which I have just received a first copy from the Chief Minister, containing a large selection of papers submitted at its annual sessions. I am sure that these papers faithfully represent the current level of serious historical research in India. I congratulate you all on the high standard that has been maintained by the volumes so far published of the comprehensive history of India brought out under your organization's auspices. I do hope it will be a priceless source material for the future researchers and students. I hope this session can be completed within the reasonable amount of time so that an authoritative historical work of reference is made available to our scholars. I compliment both the State Government of Kerala and the University of Kerala, Thiruvananthapuram, for hosting this session of the Indian History Congress. I understand that during the last 2 decades, Kerala has already hosted 3 sessions of the Indian History Congress. Most delegates at this session may not therefore be stranger to Kerala. Whatever be the occasion, those who visit Kerala from any other part of country should realize that Kerala has a message for them. They are visiting a state which occupies the top position in the Human Development Index despite limited economic resources. It has the highest literacy rates and the lowest infant mortality rate in the country. Its institutions of higher education are the pride of nation. The state has amongst the first to implement land reforms which even critics regard as among the most equitous in the country. There is much that the rest of the country can learn from Kerala. I congratulate you, Mr. Chief Minister, your government, your predecessor governments, the people of Kerala, on the very impressive achievements which you have received. I wish you all success. I thank you, distinguished members of this gathering, on the occasion of the 77th session of History Congress. All success in present conference and also in your future endeavor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.